I'm working in the New Perspectives Microsoft Access 2010 textbook. I'm in Tutorial 4. I'm on page 188 and I'm going to create a main form with a subform, and I'm going to do that using the form wizard. Now before we go on and use the form wizard, I want to demonstrate that if I select the one side of a relationship, so I've selected customer, and I go to create, and I use the form, the auto form, where it's just going to create the form quickly, and I click it, it is going to give me a form and a subform. It works that quickly. There are some drawbacks to doing it this way, in the way that it's grouped, in that when we go over to the design view and I have the form and the subform, you can see that it is really not a subform. It's the table that has come in, or it's a window that's allowing me to look through to the table. So it's really not the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and say no on this, and we're going to create a form with a subform using the form wizard. So I'll click on create, and I'm going to click on the form wizard. We've seen this before, starting with a customer table. The fields that I want to bring in from the customer table are customer ID, company, first, last, phone, and email. Since I'm only bringing in some of the fields from the customer table, I know right off that this form is not going to be very useful in adding new customers, but it should be useful in finding a customer and adding a new contract or making adjustments, modifications to an existing contract. Because the next table I'm going to add, or for my subform, is going to be contract. I'm going to bring in all the fields. Now let's take a look at this. See how contract.customerID has a different naming than the rest of the fields that are showing on my screen? But now when I go up, we see customer.customerID and contract.customerID. Because I cannot have two objects within the same greater object, so I can't have two fields in a form or two fields in a report that have the same name, Access renames these objects to the complete name, customer.customerID or contract.customerID, telling it one comes from the customer table, one comes from the contract table. In this case, we're going to put the one from the contract table back, the foreign key. Because we're using two tables, these tables know how they're related. They're related through the relationships that we set up in the relationship window in Tutorial 2. I'm going to click Next. And how do you want to view your data? If you view it by customer, you're going to get a main form for each customer. And right now we have 40 customers. So we're going to have 40 records. And with each customer, we're going to see the contracts for that particular customer. If the customer has one, we'll only see one. If they have 10, we'll see all 10 of them in the subform. If we did it by contract, we would get a form for each contract. We'd see the customer ID, and then we might see the customer ID again in the next record, because we're looking at this by contract, not by customer. We'd have 64 records, not 40. I'm going to go back to customer. So I want to see it by customer and then by contract. Form with subform. It's going to create a form, and inside of it, it's going to have a window that's going to allow me to see my subform. A linked form works well if you have a form that has a lot of data on it, and adding a subform would take up too much space. It'd be hard to view the form on your monitor. Or if the linked form has information that's rarely used. You want to have it quickly available, but it's rarely used. We're going to use a form or subform. Click Next. How do we want our subform to appear? Do we want to be tabular or datasheet? Datasheet is a more efficient use of space. It's going to look like a table or a query. If for some reason we wanted to create a main form that had within it a subform, and within that subform another subform, for example, customers have contracts and contracts have invoices, I would have to use tabular for my subform, or I would not be able to add another subform. At this point, we're not adding another subform, and datasheet is the most efficient use of space, so we'll stick with datasheet and click Next. What do we want to name these? Customer, contracts, and contract, take the space out, subform. A word to the wise here with your subform. Name your subform correctly the first time. As we move on and we get into tutorial 6, if you start renaming your subform after it's created, you're going to find that Access stores the name of that subform several different places. And so you may think you're working with one subform, and Access thinks it's working with another one. And what happens is that your calculations aren't working. So it's very, very important that when you create the titles for these forms, that you name the subform correctly the first time. If you don't name it correctly the first time, in tutorial 5 we're going to look at how you can find some of these things, but a word to the wise there. Name it correctly the first time. Contract subform finished. And my form and subform has been created. Not very attractive, but does it serve the purpose? Let's find out. When I look at my first customer, how many contracts does that customer have? 1. Let's move to the next record. Now you see 2 sets of navigation, right? This inside set of navigation works for the contracts for this customer. The outer set works for the main form. So this one's for the subform, this one's for the main form. Let's move forward 1 record. How many contracts does a customer have? 3, which is telling me that very likely my relationships are being picked up correctly and that each contract is being associated with the correct customer. Let's just take a quick look. It's kind of disconcerting when all you see is 1 and 3. 4. Good. So 1, 3, 1, 3. So we're going to go in and we're going to make some changes to this. Well, first we're going to go to Layout View, and we're going to click on our title, and we're going to put a space in between customer and contracts. The next thing that we're being asked to do is to set our column widths. Now, setting the column widths in the subform is really not the best thing to do, because remember, you're only seeing those records for this particular customer. And this customer could have contract types with very short names, where another one could have contract types with very long names. So the best way to deal with this is simply to close the main form, find the subform, contract subform, and resize the columns here. And I'm resizing them one at a time. I wouldn't have to do that. I'm resizing them one at a time because of my very small screen space. You see, this is not going to work because my window is set so low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to resize this one very narrow. There we go. Make sure that that is showing. Once it's fine, then I can come back and resize this one, and it'll move right off the screen. And I'll save that and close it, and I'll reopen my main form, and inside of my main form my column widths have been resized, and now I'm not going to mess with them. I'll leave them like they are. In this next step, I'm going to resize my subform control. It's going to be a little difficult to see simply because I'm running in such a small screen space here. But what I want to do is make sure I'm in Layout View. And in Layout View, I want to select my subform control. Make sure. And I'm going to resize it until I have room for all of my columns to show and room for a scroll bar. So I'm going to have to just start bringing it out a little bit. And because the way my window's set up, I have to resize this way so you can see it. And I'll keep bringing it out until I have enough room for all of my columns to show and room for a scroll bar. Now it looks like this contract type column is too wide, but let's go forward and take a look at some of the other records. As we move forward, you see that that column is not too wide. We have some records that need nearly all of that space. So resizing your subform based on your first record is simply not a good idea. That's why we close the form, resize the subform. We resize the subform control around that subform. So now it's working. Now I'm going to put my screen back over into a window. And so I've resized my column widths, set up my subform control. Let's look at it in form view. And again, with a small size here, hard to see, but it is working. A couple other things that I would do to this, simply because I don't like the way it looks. The other thing that I would do here is in design view, I would move these controls over a little bit because they look terrible the way they are, a little off. And if I move the subform control, it automatically moves the label for me. So when I go back to design or to form view, see, it has a nice straight edge. Now the next thing that we're going to look at here is something that could be a little scary to some of you, but I'm actually going to delete that subform control. It's gone. I selected it, I hit my delete key, it is gone. I'm going to save the form, I'm going to close the form, I'm going to reopen that form, and that subform control is gone. Now what do you do? This is such an easy fix. It is so easy, and people get so confused because they don't know how to do it. My subform is right here. There it is. It exists. All I have to do is put it back. I'm just going to drag it and drop it. Now wherever this little form icon goes, that's where the upper left-hand edge of the subform will appear, and the label will appear directly above it. So I'm going to leave room for the label. So it's going to look a little different than it did the first time. So there's my subform, and there's my label. The label, and I can resize it up a little bit, or I could grab it by its sizing handle up here, and I can move it up a little bit to get it out from underneath the subform. And let's take a look at this in layout view, or form view first, to see how it looks. And it looks like that my subform control may be a little wider than it needs to be. Let's check that out. Nope, it's too narrow. I can tell that it's too narrow because I have a scroll bar. When that scroll bar goes away, it's going to mean that it's wide enough. Scroll bar went away, but I'm still not certain that I have enough room for my vertical scroll bar. Not quite. I need a little more. It's about 1/8 of an inch, a little over. So that should do it. How can you test? Let me switch over to design view first. I'll bring my form footer down a little bit. So how do I know? Layout view, grab this and bring it up. And now you see there's enough room for vertical scroll bar without creating a horizontal scroll bar. Let me undo that, put it back like it was, and there's our form, subform, and what we looked at is if you lose your subform, accidentally delete it, remember that you can get it back by simply dragging and dropping it from your navigation pane into your main form in design view.